Started. Welcome to those who are joining us. Hello and welcome to the virtual dialogue series Beyond Borders, brought to you by the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. My name is Ricky Bevington. I'm president of the council, and our series Beyond Borders focuses on the United States' ongoing foreign policy redirects under the Trump administration. Ambassador Charles Shapiro, former U.S. ambassador to Venezuela and president emeritus of the council, will lead each dialogue with world-class experts in their fields of study and practice. That's why we're here today. A little bit more about the organization. The World Affairs Council is a nonpartisan, nonprofit membership organization whose mission is to prompt new thinking on critical global issues. And throughout the year, we feature diplomats, dignitaries, executives, and subject matter experts providing world-class analysis of everything from geopolitics to foreign policy, trade and the economy, emerging technologies, armed conflict, climate change, health and humanitarian issues, and many more topics. You can learn more about our work and also subscribe to our newsletter to find out about upcoming events. It's at wacatlanta.org, wacatlanta.org. Some housekeeping. This program is on the record. The statements made today are those of the speaker and not of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. The program we are here to enjoy today is entitled Reviving the Monroe Doctrine, Trump's Latin America Policy. Our featured expert speaker is Brian Winter, editor-in-chief of America's Quarterly and vice president of the Council of the Americas. Winter is a top expert on Latin America who has worked as a journalist for over 2 decades in Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico. We're very honored to have him here with us today. So I'll just take a few minutes to just set up the topic before I hand it over to Ambassador Shapiro to lead the discussion. A senior official in the first Trump administration said, discussing Latin America was the equivalent of your mom telling you to eat your vegetables. Well, in the second Trump administration, Latin America has moved to center stage with top priorities including immigration and, of course, the southern border. The U.S. has imposed steep tariffs on Mexico and Canada. President Trump told Congress the United States is taking back the Panama Canal. China is flexing its economic muscles in South America. And the U.S. appears to be on a collision course with Brazil, the country's largest country and the region's rather largest country and also biggest economy. Today's dialogue with Brian Winter will examine the impact of these recent developments on Latin America. And of course, the conversation will be definitely led by Ambassador Charles Shapiro. He'll lead a moderated discussion for about 30 minutes and then turn to audience questions. Please use the Q&A function there in your Zoom box. And with that, I'm pleased to welcome Ambassador Shapiro.
Thanks, Ricky. It's a pleasure. And Brian, you've now been classified as a world-class expert, so we're gonna test that. Just one note for the audience: if you do not know where the Q&A function is on your screen, take your cursor and you go down to the bottom of the screen. You'll see it says Q&A, and please use that for questions, not the chat box. The reason is it's easier for me to read it that way. So, Brian. Is the administration reviving the Monroe Doctrine? And first, back up. Tell us what, for those of us who haven't talked about the Monroe Doctrine since high school history class, what is the Monroe Doctrine in a sentence, and is it coming back?
Good morning to all of you. Good morning, Ambassador Shapiro. Thank you, Ricky, for the great introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. The Monroe Doctrine is the 202-year-old idea that foreign powers should not have a presence in the Western Hemisphere. This was originally the idea of former President James Monroe, as the name suggests, and it was originally stated in an era where in which Spain had not completely given up its colonial ambitions in the Western Hemisphere. And in an era, in fact, when Russia was laying claim to Oregon, believe it or not. And this was an idea that the countries of the hemisphere should band together to keep out European and other non-hemispheric powers. And it was actually, somewhat ironically, quite popular in Latin America in the years and decades after it was first thrown out, or whether after it was first floated. Because this was a common cause. That said, it has evolved over the years. been invoked on numerous occasions by the United States to keep out the Soviet Union. And in today's incarnation, we have a new Trump administration that is putting the Monroe Doctrine front and center. President Trump has mentioned it in speeches over the years. Secretary Rubio has as well. And today, it's not about Russia or the Soviet Union. Primarily, today, it's mostly about China. The Monroe Doctrine is being evoked to essentially declare that China is not welcome in the Western Hemisphere, that its presence in places like Panama, especially, are a direct threat to U.S. national security. I think, in conclusion, that there's a view that it's quote unquote okay for countries of the Western Hemisphere to trade with China. After all, the United States does that as well. But when it comes to strategic investment by the Chinese in, say, ports near the entrances of the Panama Canal, or new ports in places like Peru, or investment in electrical grids or other key infrastructure like telecommunications, Huawei, the view of the Trump White House is that China should not be doing those things, and that Latin American nations should be pressured to ensure that that kind of presence is not allowed.
And what does Latin America think about that?
Well, it varies by country and by ideology. And I want to, it's a difficult subject because, on the one hand, it does not obey the usual paradigm of left and right. Some of the most enthusiastic governments in Latin America when it comes to Chinese investment over the last 10 years have been right-wing governments. I'm talking about figures like Iván Duque in Colombia, former President Sebastián Piñera, the late Sebastián Piñera of Chile, or Guillermo Lasso of Ecuador. These are all presidents who are right of center and were very much aligned with the first Trump administration. But all of them made state visits to Beijing, and all of them saw the purpose of Chinese investment. Today, I think that it remains I travel a lot through the region, and I talk to everybody, or I try to talk to everybody, left, right, center, as long as they're democratically elected. And something that I hear everywhere is when I ask people what keeps you up at night, politicians say, what keeps me up at night is having to choose between Washington and Beijing. And, there has been pressure since the first Trump administration to make a choice. I would say that pressure was maintained more or less during the Biden administration, which of course adopted many of the same ideas about the strategic threat that China poses in the world and in Latin America, as we saw during the first Trump administration. But there is no doubt that pressure is now intensifying to an important degree under the second Trump administration. And the two main reasons for that, or the two main signs of that, were during the transition period, we saw a threat by Mauricio Claver Caron, who is Trump's his special envoy to Latin America, saying that tariffs should be put on goods that come through the new Chinese port in Chancay. That's in Peru. And then all these recent threats and rhetoric that we've seen around the Panama Canal, which have made very clear that, especially in that spot, the U.S. considers the Chinese presence to be unwelcome.
Why aren't U.S. companies building ports on either side of the Panama Canal and in Peru and all over Latin America, and bridges and electrical grids? I mean, why are the Chinese doing that rather than U.S. private sector companies?
That's a good question. In recent years, the U.S. has had less presence when it comes to infrastructure projects throughout Latin America. And by recent years, I mean recent decades. There are a couple of reasons for this. One is that the risk around these investments tends to be high. Another one is, or perhaps I should say was, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of the United States, which prevented U.S. companies from paying bribes, as I'm sure many people here know that that enforcement of that act has been put on quote unquote pause by the Trump administration. And then, the financing options from multilateral institutions like the IDB, the World Bank, and others, everyone agrees, Republicans or Democrats, Latin Americans and Americans, that there could be more creative use of loan guarantees and other provisions that would allow U.S. companies to get more involved. And I think everyone sees that as an imperative. But in short, I think it has to do with reasons of politics, perhaps reasons of, a lack of vision, essentially U.S. government officials, possibly some U.S. private sector officials not seeing the importance of Latin America. But I think also, to be fair, I think it has to do with business conditions on the ground in Latin America as well. Private sector companies invest because they think it'll be profitable. And I just think that the conditions have not been there in most places over the last couple of years when it comes to infrastructure. In a lot of other areas, of course, it remains, Latin America remains it punches above its weight from a global perspective when it comes to foreign direct investment coming from the United States.
Let's switch to the southern border for a minute. Crossings, what's the right word? Unauthorized crossings of the southern border at the lowest level they've been at in 25 years. I mean, it's really pretty extraordinary. What's been the impact of that in the countries that those migrants are coming from? In Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, Cuba, Venezuela. I mean, what are the consequences of? I mean, we know what the consequences are in the U.S. We're debating that, but what are the consequences in the countries that a year ago the people crossing the border come from?
Well, it's a huge change. And, the real significant downturn in numbers did not begin with the Trump administration's return. It actually began in early 2024 when the Biden administration tightened rules around asylum that had previously provided such a wide open door for people to come through when it came to when they were coming to the United States. That said, there's no doubt that the decline has accentuated since Trump was elected, and then even more since he took office, as much because of concrete things like the end of the Customs and Border Patrol app that people were using to schedule asylum appointments, but also because of signals. Everybody in the world understands that the door to the United States right now is closed, and they're reacting accordingly. I think, though, that your question references, what the conditions are like in some of these places where immigration is no longer an escape valve. And the honest answer to that is we're just starting to understand that. I think it's still recent enough that perhaps some people are thinking perhaps that it's temporary, in the same way that the decline in numbers during parts of the first Trump administration were temporary. But, I think you hear and you see reports in the media from the quote unquote coyotes, the people who are escorting, sometimes smuggling people into the United States, a realization that this may be a change for good. And that will have enormous consequences if it holds in countries that have been sending massive percentages of their people in recent years. And, the portfolio of immigration in the United States during the Biden years became much more diverse. I'm going to get these numbers more or less right. If I'm not mistaken, during the first Trump administration, something along the lines of 80% of the illegal immigration into the United States was from the Northern Triangle countries of Central America. That's Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, plus Mexico. It was mostly those countries. Over recent years, the portfolio became much more diverse. Countries like Haiti, Venezuela, And those are the two sort of big ones, along with Cuba, but also from China, from parts of sub-Saharan Africa, um, and elsewhere. So if these people are now compelled to either stay in their countries of origin or perhaps go to other countries around Latin America, as we've seen over the years with the Venezuelan diaspora, remembering that we had 8 million people leave Venezuela over the course of about a 7-year window, fewer than 1 million of them came to the United States. So we've already seen that experience of diasporas going elsewhere in the region. The effects of that will be profound, and we're just beginning to understand what they might be.
We've talked. I mean, we've been off and on with tariffs on Mexico and Canada. The tariffs on steel and aluminum are in place. The tariffs that the Trump administration has threatened on other products are not in place yet. From the Mexican perspective, is Mexico more cooperative now because of these tariffs and threatened tariffs? And is that sustainable?
Well, the short answer to the first question, like, are they more cooperative now? The short answer is yes. The slightly longer answer is yes so far, because we're still in the early days of this. I I believe that the new Mexican administration of Claudia Sheinbaum has been tougher on security. Security meaning both the control of migrants from Mexico and from other countries, as well as efforts to detect and stop the flow of fentanyl. I think that government has acted more strongly because of the pressure coming from this White House. I think that they would have been tougher than their predecessors, the Lopez Obrador administration, regardless. If you look at polls in Mexico, security issues show up as the number one concern for the Mexican population. President Sheinbaum has a technocratic profile, and very early on appointed a security chief who succeeded at some level in reducing crime when he worked for her when she was the mayor of Mexico City. So she has a record of putting resources and focus, which, as you know, both are important when you're in government. She's put both resources and focus behind this problem. But has she moved or been able to move more quickly because of the pressure coming from the White House? Yes. And she, partly as a result of her own merits, but also partly because of a certain rally around the flag effect from the Mexican population, she is almost unthinkably popular.
Yeah.
She has an approval rating upward of 85%, which, I always joke, as someone who's been following the politics, not only in my country, but in Latin America for 25 years now. Today, I feel like a 40% approval is pretty good. Like I say, 40 is the new 60. 85 is almost unheard of. And it speaks to the popularity. Her predecessor was also quite popular, but she's been able to build on that, I think, because she's addressing the security challenges, but also because people understand that she's under pressure and they're standing behind her. The way that she's managed to balance the need to placate President Trump while also maintaining a certain kind of resolute strength has been quite an extraordinary feat so far. And that's gotten attention from the international press. I mean, the Wall Street Journal and others have done articles kind of marveling at what she's been able to do. We'll see whether we're still marveling at that 3 months from now, 6 months from now, because it depends on her, but it doesn't only depend on her. If President Trump does at some point go ahead with these 25% tariffs, then I think we'll be telling a very different story.
Yeah. Switching to Brazil, your social media handle is Brazil Brian, so I'm going to guess you follow Brazil pretty closely. Brazil,
it's the country where I lived most recently. I spent 10 years of total living in Latin America as a reporter, 5 of them in Sao Paulo, Brazil. So that's and my wife and kids are also Brazilian. So
Ah,
that's part of the story as well.
so you really are Brazil, Brian.
I really am.
But Brazil has dropped off the front pages of the America's newspapers.
Mm.
One would have predicted a clash between Lula, the president of Brazil, and Donald Trump, the president of the United States, because they're so ideologically different. But I'm not even sure Brazil's been mentioned at a presidential press conference. I mean, what's going on there?
Yeah, I think a clash is coming. I think it's just a question of weeks or months, maybe. Months even sounds optimistic before we see some sort of confrontation between President Trump and President Lula in Brazil. And the reasons why they're on different sides of the aisle, certainly. Lula, they're actually about the same age. But Lula is on the left. But so is Claudia Sheinbaum, at least in theory. In practice, I think Lula is quite a bit more to the left than she is. But it's also true that there are some specific areas of conflict between President Trump and President Lula. One of them is the irresistible parallels, or at least the perception of irresistible parallels between what's happened in recent years in the United States and what's happened in Brazil. Lula's predecessor, Jair Bolsonaro, was and is quite close to Donald Trump and his family. And President Bolsonaro, in the 2022 election, he questioned the validity of the election before it even happened. He also questioned it immediately afterward. His supporters rioted in Brasilia. In fact, the dates were almost exactly the same. In the United States, we had January 6th. In Brazil, they had January 8th. It was 2 years later, but it was still practically the same calendar date. But and then both of them, of course, faced judicial proceedings. In the case of President Bolsonaro, he had his political rights stripped uh, because of his questioning of the 2022 election. Um, that is a provision under Brazilian law. They have a different system with an electoral court and so on that lets them to do that. It's also a political system that is built around the fear of dictatorship and the perceived need to protect democracy, keeping in mind that they had a dictatorship from 1964 to 1985. So I suppose you could say that they have a quicker trigger when it comes to punishing these sorts of things than the United States did. Keeping in mind that our system, as we discussed, not only can a convicted felon run for president, but there were some presidential scholars who actually thought that a president could even govern from prison if that was necessary. The Brazilian case is different. Maybe I'm getting too deep into the weeds here. The point I want to make is that President Trump sees in President Bolsonaro's story a reflection of what he perceives as the injustices that were put upon him. And so I think it's just a matter of time before President Trump demands that the Brazilian judicial system and the Brazilian government allow Jair Bolsonaro to run for president again in 2026. I don't think the Brazilian system will listen, but things could get very contentious. There are also some issues around free speech in Brazil, remembering that that's where Elon Musk had trouble with his X platform, which was briefly banned in, I guess that was last year. The years blend together a little bit right now. So much is happening, but you may have noticed that Elon Musk is quite popular in the Trump White House. So it's possible that he could use some of his influence to put together some sort of confrontation with Brazil as well. So that, we've been so focused on Mexico, on Panama, on Canada in recent weeks, but I suspect Brazil is going to be a front in some of these battles in the region quite soon.
Jair Bolsonaro was a huge fan of President Trump. The president of Argentina, Javier Milei, and the president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, both are also huge fans of President Trump. In Argentina, President Milei has been able to get runaway inflation under control. I'm not sure it is exactly where he wants it to be, but the things are rapidly improving. And in El Salvador, where crime was so rampant that people were afraid to leave their houses, President Bukele has gotten crime under control with over 40,000 gang members locked up in a high security prison. And I suspect everybody's seen the videos of the prisoners being marched in rows. And the economy is booming in El Salvador for the first time in a very long time. Are Argentina and El Salvador models for other countries in Latin America?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, look, there's no doubt that both of those leaders have had success on the economy and on security, respectively. In the case of El Salvador, there's it. I have not been recently, but people who have say that it feels like a fundamentally different country. By some measures, now has the lowest homicide rate in the entire hemisphere. Even if those numbers are, let's say, off a little bit or exaggerated, no one doubts that it is a fundamentally safer place when it comes not just to homicide, but when it comes to things like extortion, just the presence of gangs more broadly. That has come at a cost of, basically President Bukele is governed under a state of emergency authorized by Congress that has suspended things like due process and led thousands of people to be arrested unfairly, or at least very least without trial, or even in some case charges. But there's no doubt, as we saw in the recent election in which President Bukele was reelected with more than 80% of the vote, those are sacrifices that El Salvadoran society is willing to make. I'm not sure that other countries in the region that have a history of, I think of Argentina, for example, a recent history of disappearances at the hands of the state, whether they'd be willing to toss some of those basic civil rights aside quite as easily. But what El Salvador has done in Argentina and elsewhere is at least provided a model, maybe you could even call it political cover, for taking security issues much more seriously, devoting more resources and thinking, I suppose advocates of these policies would say, thinking of the well-being of the majority of the population, the law-abiding part of the population, and not obsessing, again, using their language, with the rights and privileges of the minority who are under arrest. I have my own views on that subject, but I will put them aside and say only that because of the success that we've seen in El Salvador and in Argentina, this is a big reason why the right is ascendant across much of the region right now. I mean, this is a trend that we're seeing throughout the West, aren't we? But in Latin America in particular, I think if you look at upcoming elections, there's a center-right candidate in Ecuador who may lose a runoff here in a couple of weeks for reasons that have to do with Ecuador's own security crisis. But if you look at some of the bigger countries having elections over the next year and a half, talking about Colombia, Chile, and then eventually Brazil, these are all countries where the right is either favored to win or where they have a really good chance. And this is partly because of the success of these people that you mentioned. It's also in part because of kind of bigger cultural changes, such as the spread of evangelical Christianity, which, to just cite one example, and then I'll conclude, Brazil is a country that has been transformed by this religious change. In the 1980s, just 7% of Brazil's population was evangelical. Most of the rest of the country, of course, was Catholic. Today, that number has gone from 7 to 35%, which is an incredible change in a very short period. And Brazil's National Statistics Institute thinks that evangelicals could actually be the majority in Brazil as soon as the year 2035. That has had a big impact on Brazilian politics and was directly responsible for the election of Jair Bolsonaro. Other countries in the region have not had the transformation at quite the same pace, but they've seen similar trends.
I mean, Guatemala and El Salvador sure have. I mean,
That's right.
huge increases in the evangelical Christian population there.
That's right.
That's fascinating. I think we're going to have a separate program in a few months about Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua. But just in basic terms, there's a tension in Trump administration policy. All three countries are countries that say they won't accept deportees from the United States. Venezuela's been off and on. And actually, there was a little piece this morning that now they said they will accept deportees again. And clearly, that is one of the top priorities of the Trump administration, is deporting people in the United States illegally. On the other hand, you've got within the Trump administration, and particularly in the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, an advocate for whom political change in those three countries is foremost. Is there a tension between those two goals? One is, changing the governments in Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua versus making a deal with those governments, acknowledging them, cooperating with them so they accept deportees from the United States.
Yeah, there's a big tension.
Yeah, and how
I'd
are they
like
squaring that?
I'd like to hear your perspective on this too, given your position as former ambassador to Venezuela. I know you follow all this really closely. Yes, I mean, everything indicates that there are different groups in the Trump administration who see different sides of this issue. Some people who are thinking first of immigration and making decisions based on that because they think that that's essentially what should drive the bus when it comes to Venezuela policy. And then there are people who are thinking more about the need to restore democracy to Venezuela and get rid of a dictatorship that is close to Iran and has ties with Russia and other governments as well. I would say that they're not the first administration to be pulled in different directions on this issue. Venezuela is a tragedy and a very difficult policy problem. And so it does not surprise me. It's not unusual or surprising that we have competing voices on this issue. I would note that we've already been through seemingly kind of two phases on this. The first phase was when the Trump administration's, I think his title is the envoy for special missions.
Right.
This was Richard Grenell, landed in Caracas back in January to reach, they say they weren't negotiating, but reached some sort of understanding or arrangement, let's say, with the Maduro. I mean, he met with Maduro. There are photos of him smiling as he met Maduro. And not long after that, we saw the release of U.S. hostages who had been in Venezuela, and the Venezuelan government funding deportation flights back to the United States. And this led some people to say, oh, well, this is a sign that the Trump administration has given up on the quote unquote maximum pressure tactics that it used the first time around. But that only lasted for so long because we saw a couple of weeks ago the end of the licenses that the U.S. government had granted to U.S. oil companies, allowing them, not just U.S. oil companies, but to foreign oil companies, allowing them to drill for oil, which was interpreted again as a move back in the other direction, although there was some reporting by Axios and others suggesting that this was actually a pragmatic step taken by the Trump administration to please the Congress, three congressmen in particular in Florida, so that they would have their votes as part of the larger budget negotiations. So in short, it's a difficult issue. We may continue to see this administration pulled in different directions. And, that may reflect a government that is listening to different people, that is reacting to different circumstances, that is changing its mind, or just being unpredictable. Donald Trump is figure who is proud of his unpredictability. He sees it as an asset. And this, both with Venezuela as well as Cuba, we may see continued signs of that.
It's only been, what, 50 plus days since the inauguration?
Been 53.
53, but who's counting?
Who's counting?
Yeah. Marco Rubio was confirmed unanimously in the Senate. So far as I can tell, he's the first Secretary of State we've ever had who actually speaks Spanish, knows more about Latin America than either you or I, or more than I do, but probably less than you do.
He's very knowledgeable.
He's very, very knowledgeable. Give me your 2-month assessment of Marco Rubio as Secretary of State.
Well, I think that he reflects a government that is more focused on Latin America than any U.S. administration in the last 30 years. I think you have to go back to the Clinton administration, the days of the ratification of NAFTA and the hosting of the first Summit of the Americas in Miami in 1994 to find a U.S. administration that was this focused on Latin America. And it's not just because they've appointed people like Marco Rubio, it's because this administration knows that its top domestic priorities depend on policy toward Latin America. And here I'm referring to reducing illegal immigration, reducing the flow of drugs, particularly fentanyl, and also reducing dependence on China. If you're going to accomplish those things, Latin America has to be front and center. And I would point out that the presence of Secretary Rubio is important. He is, as you know, he's the son of Cuban immigrants. He speaks Spanish fluently, but he's done the work. He's traveled, he has the connections. He knows people up and down the region. That's really important. I think if we're going to get historical again, he's probably the best connected, high-ranking official on Latin American issues since Nelson Rockefeller in the 1970s. Nelson Rockefeller was Gerald Ford's vice president, and he had a very long history in the region. But that's how far back you have to go to find somebody who is that connected. But I insist, it's not just about Secretary Rubio. The nominee for the Deputy Secretary of State is Christopher Landau. And Chris was the ambassador to Mexico during the first Trump administration. And he went to high school in Asuncion, Paraguay. And his Spanish is also exceptional. Also someone who knows Latin America very well and who likes it and who sees, the opportunity as much as the challenge. You have people like Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor, who is from Florida, with all of the, that implies, at least for most people, kind of being steeped in Latin American issues to a greater extent than in the rest of the country. And Mike Waltz, when he was in Congress, authored a bill that's in 2023 that sought to authorize the unilateral use of U.S. military force, drone strikes, essentially, maybe some other techniques against Mexican cartels. So again, this is an administration that is prioritizing Latin America. And as a result, we've seen not only Marco Rubio make his first trip as Secretary of State to the region, but we've seen high-level attention to some of these diplomatic issues over the last couple of months. It's unclear whether Latin America will be brought closer or pushed further away by this administration as we look at the next 4 years. I really do believe that's up in the air. It could be either one, because on the one hand, you have, I think everybody here is aware of just how contentious things have been around the tariffs and also the issue of the Panama Canal, some of these efforts to get China out, of places around the continent. But it's also true, as we've been saying, that there are a great many leaders and politicians elsewhere around the region who are quite happy that Donald Trump is back. And some of them are quite likely to win elections over the next couple of months. And so it's also possible to imagine a near-term future where you have a Latin America that is even more aligned with this White House than it is today.
That's great. I've got a few questions here, and I'm going to encourage more people to submit questions using the Q&A function. These first folks have figured that out. Valentine, an old friend, asks, is it really a possibility that the United States takes over the Panama Canal?
Yes. I don't think it's a high possibility, but I think it's a possibility that we have to take seriously, and the Panamanians are taking seriously. I was in Panama. I arrived the day after President Trump's inaugural speech, in which he declared explicitly his interest in taking back the canal, and people were pretty upset.
Yeah, I imagine.
You know, in the private sector, in government, and elsewhere. And it's not hard to understand why. It's worth pointing out that this is and was and is a government that is right of center, that considers itself an ally of the United States. I've heard people say that you'd be hard pressed to find another more pro-Washington president in Latin America than President Molino. But that did not insulate them from this issue. I think that, there are those of us who believe that this is mostly about China, and that the U.S. government, and here I use the U.S. government rather than just the Trump administration, because this was actually, let's put it this way: concern about China's presence near the canal and in the area around the canal predates the Trump administration, or at least the second Trump administration. President Trump said that there were Chinese troops in the canal. That is not true. But the Chinese did control, through Hong Kong-based company, two of the ports on either side of the canal. And there are people throughout the U.S. government who saw that as an unacceptable security risk to the United States, given essentially the strategic importance of the canal. The canal sees about 40% of U.S. maritime shipping container trade, and if I'm not mistaken, about 4% of global trade overall. Any kind of disruption through the canal would have huge implications for the U.S. economy, as well as for the U.S. Navy and sort of military assets writ large. And so the view that having China or a Chinese company in such proximity to the canal, capable perhaps of some sort of, a so-called gray zone attack or gray zone incident, for example, an oil spill, which could be used to disrupt the canal, with no state ever claiming direct responsibility. I think that makes that concern, even if you don't necessarily share it, it makes sense to a lot of people. But, the question everyone now has is whether it's just about that, because the Hong Kong-based company that I mentioned agreed to sell those ports after coming under pressure from the Panamanian government over the last couple of weeks. And yet, President Trump has continued to say that he wants the canal back. And he may well, I think he appears to be interested in a new era of U.S. expansionism that also potentially includes Greenland, maybe Canada, and the Panama Canal, and perhaps even Gaza as well. I don't know if that belongs in the same category or not. There is a doctrine behind all of this. I listened recently to an interview with Steve Bannon in which he explained it in conversation with a Canadian reporter. The essence of the argument was about hemispheric security, the view that China is a threat and is making inroads, that China could encroach on the U.S. via the Arctic, and that is why Canada and Greenland are necessary acquisitions, not his word, not mine either. And that, direct control of the canal would be necessary to keep the Chinese out of the Caribbean, which of course has sometimes been referred to as the United States' third border. Just yesterday, we saw a report from NBC News citing unnamed officials, that the Trump White House has asked the Pentagon to prepare military options for Panama. The story made clear or quoted unnamed people saying that a invasion was unlikely, but it did raise the possibility of U.S. troops back in the Canal Zone alongside the Panamanian military. And that felt to me, and this is conjecture on my part, but that felt to me like a potential goal of this administration. So we'll see where it goes. I mean, I certainly, the Panamanians are very concerned about this. I think it's fair to note also that others around Latin America, other officials are watching this very closely, because again, the question is not left versus right, or even whether you're pro-Washington or not. Sovereignty is a red line for many governments and many politicians around the Americas. And I think reactions to this in a variety of countries could be unpredictable if we continue to go down this road.
I would actually amend your answer to say sovereignty is a red line for every government I've ever dealt with anywhere in the world.
It is. I would note, though, and the Panamanians have certainly noticed this, that there has not yet been a chorus of support from elsewhere in Latin America. And there were, I think,
a chorus of support for which?
For Panama.
For Panama.
Yeah. I mean, I think there may have, I've heard it argued that there was an era in which this would already be in front of the OAS, and you'd see declarations of support from other countries, even, I think of Brazil. It's curious to me that Brazil has not really spoken up on this. And I think some of this is because governments are hoping or believing that these discussions are best carried out in private. Nobody wants to be kind of put behind the 8 ball. Nobody wants a bullseye on their back, I suppose you'd say. But there's also some deep left-right divisions in the region. And I suspect it has to do partly with that as well. Molino's a conservative government.
Yeah.
And so the idea of somebody like Lula speaking up for him is perhaps not, it's not happening yet.
Gene Hanratty, who's retired U.S. Army colonel, asks the following. Does China bring in Chinese labor for Belt and Road projects? How does this set with local government? So in the port of Chancay in Peru, was it built by Chinese laborers or Peruvian laborers? There's a bridge that I understand the Chinese are building in Panama over the Panama Canal. Is that being done by Chinese laborers or by Peruvian workers? Excuse me, Panamanian workers.
I like to say I don't know when I don't know. I believe there have been reports of Chinese laborers being used on some individual projects. That's been a more contentious issue in Africa than it has in Latin America. I remember 15 years ago, there was an incident in which the Chinese wanted to bring their own people to build a new embassy in Brasilia. The Brazilian government protested, and in the end, they used local labor. But I can't speak to whether some of those specific projects that you cited, whether they've used Chinese workers or not. In most cases, I feel safe saying it's been local labor that's been used for these projects.
I mean, that's interesting because I've had my experience is older than yours and somewhat out of date. And I bet some of the people on this call may know the answer, but my experience has been the opposite. I mean, I watched the Chinese build cricket stadiums in the Caribbean and bring in Chinese workers to literally dig the ditches to do the most basic work. Not engineers, but common workers. So we need to find out.
Maybe I'm thinking too much of the big countries, where I've spent most of my time, and where some of these issues of sovereignty are taken perhaps a bit more seriously.
Yeah. Martin Danancon, and apologize for mispronouncing your name almost certainly, asked, do you see Brazil getting closer to China economically in the coming years? Lula sees himself as a voice of the global South, an advocate of multilateralism. How does all that fit together?
Well, that's a great question. It's a question that's been on my mind a lot and on many minds over these last 2 months because of, these contentious things we've been talking about. Articles have been written already, essentially saying that the Trump White House's heavy-handed tactics risk pushing governments like Brazil into the arms of China. And I question whether that's true for two reasons. One of them has to do with conditions within China itself. Chinese outbound foreign direct investment has been falling, and it's been falling everywhere, and it's been falling in Latin America specifically. Measuring it is difficult, but I've seen numbers that put it down by about a third compared to a couple of years ago. And so that suggests a Chinese presence that is still very important. But again, talking about investment, it's true that China is the #1 trading partner for a lot of South American countries, including Brazil, Chile, and some others. But the U.S. remains the biggest investor in most of these places. And so, countries can expand their trading relationship, but is China really in a position to replace the United States on some of these investment and sort of more strategic alliances? I question whether that's true or not. And the second reason has to do with local politics. Lula may want to strengthen ties with Beijing, but he may only have another year and a half to do it. Even if he runs again in 2026, and I'm not sure he will, but even if he does, it's an open question whether he'll be favored to win. Brazil, for reasons that we've already talked about, is increasingly kind of a center-right country. And if you look at the array of candidates over there, these are governments that, they have had a pragmatic attitude toward China in the past. Bolsonaro was certainly a case of that. He used very aggressive rhetoric when he was a candidate in 2018 against China, and then was very accommodating, not only on trade, but even struck a deal with Huawei while he was in office, showing again that this is not always a left-right issue. My point, I suppose, is that if you look at the likely winners of upcoming elections in Colombia, Chile, Brazil, these all look to me like they would be enthusiastic allies of not only the United States, but the Trump administration specifically. So there may be some cases where governments seek to expand those ties. You certainly don't want to be complacent if you're Washington. I think it's a risk that people there should be thinking about, but perhaps that risk has been overstated by some people.
I have part of the answer to the question I didn't know the answer to, and this is from Juan Ferrero, who lives in Bogota. And he says, I know from the book, and we know Juan, I know from the Bogota Metro that the main engineers and managers are Chinese, but all the labor is local.
Okay.
And
he
guesses it would be the same everywhere else.
Even that's important. Well, thank you for that.
Okay. We're getting to the last few minutes. So I apologize for a complicated question here, and I want a short answer so we can get more questions in with shorter answers.
Okay.
I have to start out this from former ambassador to Guatemala, Steve McFarland, who says, this is great, you're brilliant, and I'm asking fabulous questions. On the one, so you know how smart Steve is. Trump is pushing hard with threats to use the military to assert U.S. dominance in the hemisphere. At the same time, he has eliminated soft power tools such as USAID, support for democracy and anti-corruption, and has devalued existing U.S. trade agreements and alliances. How do you see this apparent contradiction playing out the next couple of years?
Well, that's a big question.
That's a big question. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that.
Oh, look, the first thing that comes to mind, and I'm a writer, and so I always like to I prefer to think about these things and then offer my best response. But in the spirit of this event, let me try to give a short answer. Well, perhaps the nature of U.S. power is changing before our eyes. Um, the U.S., the American people have voted twice now, in my view, maybe you could even argue 3 times, for less trade, for a more insular nation, in the belief that that will cause manufacturing jobs to return to the United States. You can question whether that's going to happen. I do. But there's no doubt that that's what Trump stood for when he was elected both times. And I didn't see a lot of daylight on trade issues and the zeal for free trade deals with the Biden administration, which was
Right.
also not a fan. That's different from the United States that we all grew up with. It's a more inward-looking United States, and I think that other countries around the region understand that. You have countries like Brazil that, finally feel like maybe the US has caught up with them. That's a country where they've certainly had their share of tariffs over time. They're not the only ones. Um, but I can see, and I do see on a regular basis in my conversations with politicians on the right in places like Chile, Brazil, Colombia, and elsewhere, that there's a soft power inherent in shared values, a belief that government should be small, that security policy should be tough, and that governments are charged with looking primarily after the national interest. Those are things that these leaders believe as well. So it's a different kind of soft power than the ones that we're accustomed to. I don't know if it's stickier, like will it really bind nations together in the way that trade did, or will it be more subjected to the kind of ebbs and flows of political cycles? I would personally argue the latter, but there's no doubt that, that's the world we're in right now.
Just got a couple of minutes left, and we're going to bring Ricky back on. And I want to ask you, I promised this question: what's your favorite bar or restaurant in Brazil?
Now, this is the toughest question you've asked me today, but I will say that I have a book about Sao Paulo coming out in October that's meant for people who are going to the region or going to Sao Paulo for the first time, business travelers above all, because that's usually who goes to Sao Paulo. If you're traveling for pleasure, you go to Rio. But on the 46th floor of a building downtown called the Edificio Italia, there is a wonderful cocktail bar where you can look out over this, sea of skyscrapers that is Sao Paulo, city of 23 million, and the little twinkling lights almost look like the ocean. Almost. And you can get a good caipirinha or Manhattan or whatever suits you. And Sao Paulo seems almost serene from up there. So that would be my answer.
That's great. That's great. Somebody says he's got 5 questions and he can't get them in, and he's going to send them to me, and I'm going to send them to you, and we'll get back to him. This is Sergio Munoz, who's a very good friend and a syndicated columnist whose columns carried around Latin America. This is terrific. This has been great, Brian. I want to thank you very much, and want to thank our audience and thank them for the terrific questions. And we've got more that haven't been answered, unfortunately. Ricky, can you take us out? Tell us what's coming up, what we need to pay attention to. It sounds like not.
No, she's on mute.
I was being charming. I was saying we only asked Brian to give us an hour of his time. Otherwise, we would love to go on another 30 minutes so that we could have everyone's questions answered. So thank you so much to our audience for joining us. Thank you to Ambassador Charles Shapiro for leading this conversation entitled Reviving the Monroe Doctrine, Trump's Latin America Policy. This is part of a series called Beyond Borders that focuses on the United States' ongoing foreign policy redirects under the Trump administration. And of course, our featured expert speaker was Brian Winter, editor-in-chief of America's Quarterly. This discussion was brought to you by the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. You will be able to find the video of today's dialogue posted on our YouTube channel. Please subscribe to our newsletter at our website, wacatlanta.org. That is where we will announce the next installment of the Beyond Borders series. And in the meantime, we look forward to seeing you at a future program, either in person or online. Thank you to Charles, thank you to Brian, and thank you to our guests. Have a great day.
Thanks again, Brian. Thank you, everybody in the audience.
All right, bye-bye.